Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, perhaps wrap ourselves in something soft, and embark on a rather fascinating journey back in time. We're going to explore the unvarnished truth of daily life in Victorian England, focusing specifically on a subject that most of us today take for granted: hygiene. It's a tale not of grand battles or royal intrigue, but of the persistent everyday struggle against filth, disease, and societal norms that were by our standards quite remarkable. As you settle deeper into the quiet of this evening, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft like on the video. Only, of course, if these historical whispers find a welcome place in your thoughts and offer a calming companion for your night. And feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're drifting from tonight. Now let's begin our quiet exploration into the gritty realities of Victorian life and how a revolution in cleanliness forever changed the world. Imagine for a moment that you are waking up in London, not today, but in the mid-19th century. The year is, say, 1850. The city outside your window is not the polished, brightly lit metropolis we know, but a sprawling, booming urban center grappling with unprecedented growth and the sheer overwhelming volume of its own existence. The very first sensation to assault your groggy mind wouldn't be the sound of distant traffic or the gentle hum of modern life, but rather an immediate, overwhelming impression upon your nostrils: the air itself. It is thick, heavy, almost chewy, and it seems to stick in your throat a visceral presence that you can almost taste. This isn't just a general unpleasantness. It's a symphony of decay, a horrific amalgamation of scents that cling to everything. There's the sharp, acrid tang of human waste mingling with the sickly sweet reek of rotting garbage left to fester in narrow alleyways. Overlaying this is the pervasive smoky blanket from thousands upon thousands of coal fires, a constant, gritty reminder of industry and the struggle for warmth. But then beneath it all, there's an indescribable undertone, something sweet and sick and profoundly wrong. Perhaps the subtle scent of stagnant water, unwashed bodies, or the slow, inexorable decay of life itself. This constant, inescapable presence of stench isn't just an odor. It is a physical presence, a palpable weight in the atmosphere. You'd taste it in the air, a metallic, putrid note that coats your tongue even indoors. It was everywhere, seeping into fabrics, clinging to hair, embedding itself in the very walls of your dwelling. The psychological impact of such an environment is profound. When everyone's environment is gross, when the baseline of sensory input is a constant affront, what was once revolting eventually becomes normalized. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the truly horrific becomes merely inconvenient. You'd simply breathe it in and day out, largely unaware of the silent, microscopic warfare it heralded. Your uncomfortable surroundings offer little respite. The bedding you've just risen from would likely be rough, scratchy, and far from the soft, fresh linen we associate with comfort. No Egyptian cotton, certainly, no fabric softener. Those luxuries were a century or more away. You might be lucky to have sheets at all, and they would be washed infrequently, carrying the accumulated odors of sleep sweat and the omnipresent city air. Look around your living space. The walls would often be damp, a faint, clammy chill permeating the plaster. In the corners, you'd spot what would politely be described as weird green stuff, mold or mildew, creeping tendrils of damp decay that everyone simply ignored. It was just a part of the backdrop, another silent testament to the constant battle against dampness and decay in homes that were built without proper ventilation or insulation, designed more for minimal cost than maximum comfort. The very structure of your dwelling seemed to sigh with the burden of its inhabitants and the insidious creep of the elements. As you take in these damp, mold-fringed walls, your awareness would shift to the sheer proximity of other human beings. For the vast majority of Londoners, your living space would be a single cramped room, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, shared not just with your immediate family, but potentially with 6 to 8 other people, some of whom might even be strangers. Think about that for a moment. Every breath you took, every sound you made, every private moment, or what should have been one, was shared. The very concept of personal privacy, that quiet sanctuary for individual thought or action, simply did not exist. It was a luxury reserved almost exclusively for the very wealthy, a privilege beyond the wildest imaginings of the working class. This constant, unavoidable proximity meant shared air, shared warmth, shared every single aspect of daily existence from the mundane to the intimate. And crucially, it meant an immediate and inescapable closeness to disease. If one person fell ill, the others were almost certainly next in line, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, trapped in a petri dish of shared humanity. Even if you were fortunate enough to belong to the burgeoning Victorian middle class, your living conditions, while better, were still relative, existing on a completely different plane from what we consider comfortable today. You might have had your own bedroom, perhaps even your own bed, which would have felt like an enormous step up. But the fundamental conveniences we consider necessities simply weren't there. There was no running water on demand in your home, no flick of a switch for electric lights. Those innovations were still in their infancy, or not yet dreamed of for domestic use. The bathroom, as a modern concept, a dedicated room with a flushing toilet, a basin with taps and a bathtub, was a futuristic fantasy. You might have a chamber pot under your bed, or perhaps access to a shared privy in the yard. But the idea of a personal indoor sanitation hub was still far off. This brings us quite inevitably to the fascinating and often bewildering topic of Victorian bathing practices. It's important to understand that Victorians genuinely believed in maintaining good hygiene. They weren't willfully dirty, not in their own minds. However, their definition of clean and their understanding of how to achieve it were vastly remarkably different from ours. There was a widespread and deeply ingrained conviction that too much bathing was not only unnecessary, but genuinely dangerous. Water, especially cold water, was thought to weaken your constitution, make you sick, or even in the most extreme popular theories, kill you. It was seen as something that opened your pores, allowing disease to creep in, or that somehow sapped your vital energies. So while cleanliness was valued, it was pursued with a cautious, almost fearful reverence for water itself. Given these prevailing beliefs, the infrequency of full baths was to modern sensibilities quite astonishing. Most people, even those who considered themselves fancy or fastidious, would take a full bath only once a week. For the poor, a full immersion might happen once a month, if that. The thought of a daily full bath would have been considered utterly insane, a sign of extreme eccentricity, or perhaps even a direct invitation for illness. It was simply not done. The logistics alone, with no running water and the need to heat large quantities of it over a fire, made it a monumental undertaking. Instead, the primary method of cleaning for the vast majority of Victorians was the sponge bath ritual. This was a daily or semi-daily, depending on circumstance, affair, focused quite meticulously on the important bits. You would address your face, hands, armpits, and let's be delicate, your naughty bits. Everything else waited for that rare, scheduled full bath. The process itself involved standing in your bedroom, perhaps behind a privacy screen, if you were lucky, or simply in the open if space was truly limited. You'd have a wooden washstand upon which sat a ceramic bowl and a pitcher of cold water. Hot water on demand was, as mentioned, effectively magic. So you'd pour a small amount of cold water into the bowl, dip a cloth or sponge, and methodically spot clean the designated areas. This was less about feeling truly clean and more about maintaining a baseline of presentability, a quiet acknowledgement of the daily grime without inviting the supposed dangers of too much water. It was a practical compromise in a world that fundamentally misunderstood its own relationship with health and cleanliness. Even for the most affluent Victorians, bathing remained a limited affair, though certainly more luxurious in its execution than the sponge bath. If you were truly well-to-do, you might possess one of the coveted fancy copper bathtubs, a gleaming ornate vessel that would likely be a showpiece in itself. But unlike today, where you simply turn a tap and hot water flows endlessly, the process of filling this grand tub was an immense labor-intensive undertaking. Servants, often several of them, would toil to carry countless buckets of hot water from the kitchen heated over a roaring fire to the bathroom. Imagine the steam, the effort, the sheer physical strain involved in preparing a single bath. This logistical hurdle alone meant that even the hygiene enthusiasts among the elite rarely bathed more than twice a week. Daily immersion was still largely unheard of, an extravagant waste of time, effort, and precious fuel. Perhaps one of the most curious aspects of this practice to our modern sensibilities was the common habit of multiple family members using the same bathwater. It was an unspoken practical economy in a world where heated water was such a commodity. The head of the household, typically the father, would bathe first, enjoying the freshest water. Then perhaps the mother would follow, and finally the children, often in descending order of age. By the time the youngest child dipped a toe in the water would be, well, let's just say it resembled a rather murky soup-like concoction, lukewarm, and holding the detritus of several prior washes. No amount of charming Victorian politeness could truly disguise the grim reality of that shared aquatic experience. The era also spawned some truly bizarre bathing advice often found in popular Bath for Dummies books aimed at those navigating the new bewildering world of personal cleanliness. Imagine reading instructions such as, "Do not wash your face when traveling unless you can purify the water with alcohol or ammonia first. Because you know a splash of harsh chemicals on your delicate skin was apparently preferable to the mysterious dangers lurking in unpurified travel water." There were also fads like the Russian baths, which involved alternating between extremely hot and extremely cold water supposedly to tighten the skin and prevent wrinkles. One can only imagine the shock to the system and perhaps the very limited efficacy of such a jarring routine. It was a time of earnest experimentation, often without the benefit of scientific understanding, leading to a wonderfully peculiar blend of common sense and utter nonsense. Moving from the broader subject of bodily cleanliness, let's turn our attention to a truly ghastly endeavor, oral hygiene. The very concept of fresh breath and gleaming teeth, so ubiquitous in modern advertising, was a far-flung dream for most Victorians. While rudimentary toothbrushes did exist, they were truly crude tools. Picture a wooden handle topped with stiff, coarse animal hair bristles, more akin to a tiny scrub brush designed for stubborn grime than for the delicate surfaces of your gums and teeth. These weren't soft-bristled, ergonomically designed wonders. They were abrasive, often painful, and frankly, not very effective. And their cost. A single toothbrush could set you back the equivalent of a week's groceries for a working-class family. Think about that for a moment, the choice between feeding your family and attempting a rather brutal clean of your teeth. Most people quite logically chose the former. For the vast majority, especially, the poor, proper dental care was an impossible luxury, leaving them to improvise with truly grim DIY solutions. You might chew on a stick of celery, hoping its fibrous texture would scrape away some plaque. Or if you were feeling particularly ambitious, you might concoct your own toothpaste from ingredients that would make a modern dentist faint. Chalk soot or even powdered cuttlefish bone were common choices. Yes, on purpose, imagine brushing your teeth with fine black soot or the gritty residue of calcium carbonate. The taste alone would be enough to deter most people, let alone the actual abrasive and potentially damaging effects on your enamel. It was a daily battle against decay and odor with tools and substances that often did more harm than good. And if these primitive attempts failed, as they almost invariably did, the prospect of actual dental care was terrifying. Professional dentists, as we know them today, were largely absent. Instead, if you were suffering from a raging toothache that simply wouldn't abate, you'd likely seek out the services of your local barber, or, quite remarkably, the blacksmith. Yes, the same individual who trimmed your hair might also be the one to pull your aching tooth. Or even more tellingly, the person who shod horses might turn their considerable strength and crude tools to your mouth. There was no anesthesia. The concept was still experimental and unreliable, if it existed at all for such procedures. You would simply be held down, probably given something to bite on, and endure the searing, unimaginable pain as a pair of pliers or something similarly unsuited for delicate dental work was applied. There was no proper training, no understanding of sterile practices, just brute force and a desperate need for relief. It was without hyperbole a ghastly endeavor, and one that most people avoided until the pain became utterly unbearable. The consequences of such brutal dental practices were predictably widespread and often permanent. Many Victorians, particularly as they aged, found themselves with few, if any, of their natural teeth remaining. This wasn't merely a matter of aesthetics. It profoundly impacted their ability to chew food, leading to digestive issues, and often slurred or impaired speech. While false teeth did exist, they were of incredibly poor quality. Early dentures might be carved from wood, or even more grimly, incorporate the actual teeth of deceased people or animals, often extracted from battlefield casualties or harvested from paupers' graves. Imagine biting into your supper with a set of ill-fitting, likely rotting, and profoundly unhygienic teeth pulled from a stranger. George Washington's famous and famously uncomfortable dentures, for instance, were a combination of human teeth, animal teeth, and carved hippopotamus ivory, a testament to the poor state of dental prosthetics, even for the most influential figures of an earlier era. Such was the grim reality of oral care, leaving many to simply endure toothaches until extraction was unavoidable, or to live out their lives in a state of quiet, constant discomfort. Now let's consider hair care, an aspect of Victorian hygiene that was simultaneously unwashed and remarkably elaborate. For both men and women, washing one's hair was an infrequent affair, perhaps once a month if you were diligent, or even less often for many. The idea of a daily shampoo and rinse was again pure fantasy. Shampoo, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, people experimented with various homemade concoctions. Women might work egg yolks into their scalps, believing it would add shine and cleanse. Vinegar, black tea, rum, or even rosemary were also pressed into service, each offering its own unique promise of cleanliness or fragrance. The rinsing process was equally rudimentary, pitchers of water poured over the head, often without the benefit of a warm flow. You can imagine the resulting interesting smells that would emanate from hair treated with eggs tea or stale rum, only to be left unwashed for weeks on end. The air itself, remember, was a tapestry of odors, so perhaps one's own hair contributing its subtle bouquet was less noticeable in the grand scheme of things. For women, this infrequent washing was compounded by the fashion of elaborate piled-up hairstyles that could take hours to construct and were often maintained for weeks at a time. These towering structures, often achieved with the aid of horsehair padding wireframes and copious amounts of pins, were then heavily treated with oils and pomades to hold them in place. The problem: these oils, when left undisturbed and exposed to the elements and the body's natural warmth, would inevitably go rancid. The end result was hair that, after a few days, might subtly begin to smell like rancid fat, a rather unpleasant buttery decaying odor that would hover around the wearer. To add to this, sugar water or beer were sometimes used for setting curls, creating a sticky residue that, combined with the oils, pomades, and facial powder, gradually formed a stiff, almost impenetrable helmet effect. This was a testament to patience and dedication to fashion, but certainly not to cleanliness. For the wealthiest women who could afford wigs, not the elaborate powdered rococo wigs of the 18th century, but still substantial hairpieces, another layer of complexity was added. These towering structures, often adorned with feathers, ribbons, jewels, or even miniature ships. Yes, miniature ships were incredibly hot and heavy, and almost inevitably they became a perfect breeding ground for lice and other unpleasant insects. Maintaining these elaborate wigs required specialist attention, as they couldn't simply be washed at home. They were expensive, uncomfortable, and often led to scalp infections due to the lack of air circulation and proper cleaning underneath. It was a trade-off high fashion at the cost of personal comfort and often health. Men's grooming, while perhaps less visually dramatic than women's elaborate coiffures, carried its own set of dangers. Shaving, for instance, was a precarious daily ritual performed with straight razors. These were incredibly sharp exposed blades with no safety features whatsoever. A slip of the hand could lead to a nasty cut, or worse. For many men, the solution was to rely on barbers who would perform the daily shave. However, this often meant using shared, unsterilized razors, a prime vector for the spread of skin diseases and infections. Barbers might simply wipe the blade on a cloth between customers, with no understanding of the microscopic dangers lurking on the steel. Given these risks, it's perhaps no surprise that mustaches and beards became increasingly popular for men in the Victorian era, offering a much easier and safer alternative to daily shaving. Beyond the aesthetic and practical considerations, facial hair also served a rather unexpected function. It acted as a natural filter. A thick mustache or beard would trap all manner of environmental debris, food particles from meals, tobacco dust from pipes and cigars, and the ubiquitous coal dust and general grime that permeated the air of Victorian cities. It was a silent, rather unhygienic testament to the polluted environment, and one can only imagine the odors that would accumulate in a well-established beard after a week of absorbing the city's various effluvia, offering a rather unique olfactory experience to anyone who got too close. Beyond the personal rituals of bathing and hair, there was the Herculean task of laundry and clothing, a constant back-breaking struggle against the grime of daily life. The very notion of a washing machine was still a futuristic dream, meaning everything, absolutely everything, had to be done by hand. For the vast majority of households, wash day was not a quick load or two. It was a full, grueling day of labor that could literally consume every waking hour. Imagine scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing heavy, soiled fabrics, often in cold water, for 12 or even 14 hours straight. It was an exhausting, physically demanding ordeal that left little time or energy for anything else. As a result, laundry was not done daily or even every few days. It was an infrequent event, perhaps once a week, if you were incredibly lucky and well-resourced, but often far less frequently for poorer families with garments going weeks between washes. Soap. The essential tool for this arduous task was surprisingly expensive. It wasn't the readily available mass-produced commodity it is today. Manufacturing processes were still developing, and ingredients were costly. This economic reality forced Victorians to become incredibly resourceful, or perhaps desperate, in their stain treatment and odor removal. For oil stains, chalk might be rubbed into the fabric to absorb the grease. For blood or grass stains, kerosene, a volatile and flammable substance, might be applied. A rather risky endeavor, one imagines. And for general odor removal, or perhaps just to lighten fabrics, milk was sometimes used, its gentle acids supposedly helping to break down grime. Perhaps the most shocking to our modern sensibilities was the use of human urine as a bleaching agent, particularly for linens. The ammonia content in urine was indeed an effective, albeit rather unappetizing, way to whiten fabrics. The very thought of soaking your linens in urine, then scrubbing them by hand, gives you a profound appreciation for modern detergents and washing machines. The consequence of infrequent washing expensive soap and the sheer volume of fabric in Victorian clothing was that garments were worn for days, sometimes weeks on end. Think about the layers. Women's fashion in particular involved heavy, layered fabrics, corsets, petticoats, voluminous skirts, all designed to create a specific silhouette, but also perfectly designed to absorb every ounce of sweat, body odor, food smells, and the pervasive smoke and grime of the city. These odors were not just unpleasant. They were quite literally trapped in the fabric, becoming a part of the garment itself until the next distant wash day. It's no wonder that a subtle aroma was a constant companion to most people, an accepted fact of life. Victorian clothing was also remarkably practical in its design, often serving as a visual disguise for the unavoidable dirt. Dark colors and elaborate patterns were popular not just for aesthetics, but because they expertly hid stains and smudges that would otherwise be glaringly obvious. A smudge of soot or a splash of street grime would simply blend into the dark wool of a gentleman's suit. The long skirts of women's dresses, sweeping the ground as they walked, were not only fashionable, but also incredibly practical. They hid dirty shoes and stockings, effectively sweeping up the street filth as the wearer moved, a rather effective, if unhygienic, form of natural street cleaning. Men's dark suits similarly blended seamlessly with the omnipresent coal dust, the unfortunate splatter of horse manure, and the occasional splashback from overflowing sewage that might accumulate on London's grimy streets. It was a fashion dictated as much by practicality and necessity as by taste. Now we must delve into a topic that often goes unmentioned, but was a significant part of daily life for Victorian women: intimate hygiene. In an era utterly devoid of modern conveniences, the lack of accessible and effective menstrual products presented a very real challenge. The concept of disposable pads or tampons was centuries away. Instead, women relied on rags, strips of cloth meticulously cut from old clothing, discarded linens, or any absorbent fabric they could procure. These weren't prepackaged, sterile items. They were homemade, reused, and managed with incredible discretion and effort. The process of washing and reusing these rags was again a manual and intimate affair. After use, they would be rinsed in cold water, specifically cold to prevent stains from setting, then scrubbed with what little soap was available. Once cleaned, they had to be hung to dry often indoors and in discreet locations such as bedrooms, attics, or basements to avoid scandal and preserve privacy in a society that preferred to pretend such natural bodily functions simply didn't exist. The lack of privacy that pervaded general Victorian hygiene extended deeply into the realm of intimate care. For wealthy women, the burden of managing these rags often fell to their servants, leading to an uncomfortable reality where intimate personal details became grist for household gossip, a subtle but persistent erosion of dignity. Adding to the physical discomfort and logistical challenges of intimate hygiene were the truly bizarre medical theories surrounding menstruation. Doctors of the era, operating with a profound lack of anatomical and physiological understanding, often believed that menstruation was caused by hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any female ailment or emotional display, or even that women became temporarily insane during their periods. Such ignorant beliefs led to truly outlandish and often dangerous prescribed treatments. Cold baths were sometimes recommended, a chilling and likely ineffective remedy for menstrual cramps. Bloodletting, already a common and ill-advised practice for various ailments, might also be applied. And perhaps most horrifyingly, doses of mercury, a highly toxic substance, were occasionally prescribed for cramps, unknowingly leading to brain damage, kidney failure, birth defects, and a host of other devastating side effects, all in the name of treatment. Progress in this area was excruciatingly slow. The first disposable products began to appear only in the late 1800s, but they were crude by today's standards, often just cotton wadding or thick, bulky pads held in place with belts. Crucially, they were also expensive, limiting access to all but the most affluent women. For the majority, rags remained the standard practice well into the 20th century. It was a gradual, incremental shift not only in product availability, but more significantly in societal understanding. The slow, painful realization that menstruation was a normal biological process, rather than a moral failing or a sign of mental illness, took generations to take root. This societal ignorance and discomfort highlight the profound lack of basic knowledge about the human body that permeated even seemingly enlightened Victorian society. Perhaps no aspect of Victorian life better illustrates the monumental challenge of hygiene than waste management, or rather, the stark absence of any organized system. London in the mid-19th century was effectively an open sewer city. With a rapidly swelling population of 2 million people, the sheer volume of waste generated daily was incomprehensible, and there was simply no organized garbage collection or street cleaning to manage it. So what happened to all that rubbish? People simply threw their garbage directly into the street. It would sit there festering, rotting, attracting swarms of flies in the summer, and becoming a sludgy, unspeakable mess in the rain. Rats, of course, thrived in this environment, scurrying through the refuse constant companions to the human inhabitants. Human waste disposal was an even more egregious problem. Chamber pots, those ubiquitous bedroom companions, were used indoors for nighttime needs. Their contents were then routinely emptied directly into the streets, casually tossed from windows, or deposited into shared backyard privies, essentially glorified holes in the ground shared by multiple families. For wealthier homes, an even more insidious problem lurked beneath cesspools. These were large, often open pits of human waste frequently located in the basements or directly under the living spaces of affluent residences. Imagine the constant unseen fermentation, the slow release of noxious gases and disease-laden particles directly under your dining room. It was a truly horrifying thought, a silent threat bubbling just beneath the floorboards. A specific, rather unsung profession emerged from this grim necessity, the night soil men. These specialized workers were tasked with the unenviable job of emptying cesspools and privies, literally scooping out the accumulated human waste. As their name suggests, they worked exclusively at night, a testament to the disgusting nature of their job, and an attempt to limit the public's exposure to the sight and smell of their endeavors. The disposal of this collected waste was for the most part equally unsanitary. The primary recipient of London's collective effluent was the River Thames. This majestic river, the lifeblood of the city, was simultaneously London's main source of drinking water. It created a vicious, inescapable cycle of contamination. People consumed water tainted with their own and their neighbors' waste, fell ill, and contributed more waste to the very source of their sickness. And then there was the equine problem. Thousands upon thousands of horses were essential to the functioning of Victorian London. They pulled carriages for the wealthy, hauled goods in wagons for merchants, and drew the omnibuses that transported the masses. Each horse, on average, produced approximately 35 pounds of manure daily. Multiply that by tens of thousands of horses, and you have an astonishing, almost unimaginable quantity of organic waste accumulating in the streets. When it rained, this manure transformed into rivers of nastiness, a foul brown current flowing along the gutters. In dry periods, it pulverized into fine dust, creating clouds of unsanitary pathogenic particles that were inhaled with every breath. The city was quite literally drowning in its own refuse, animal and human alike, a testament to unchecked growth and a profound lack of public health infrastructure. Amidst this pervasive squalor and the constant threat of illness, Victorian medicine was, by our modern standards, a chaotic and often terrifying landscape. Doctors, while often well-intentioned, lacked fundamental understanding of disease causation. Their treatments were largely based on a process of educated guessing, often informed by centuries-old theories that had little basis in reality. This meant that many of the common practices of the time were not only ineffective, but actively harmful, exacerbating the very conditions they were meant to treat. It was a medical frontier, and the inhabitants of Victorian London were often the unwitting test subjects. One of the most prevalent and damaging practices was bloodletting. The prevailing medical theory held that many illnesses were caused by an excess of bad blood or imbalanced humors within the body. To correct this perceived imbalance, doctors would literally drain blood from patients. This could be done through various methods, making cuts with a lancier, applying leeches to draw blood, or using suction cups. Whether the ailment was a simple headache, a broken leg, or a serious fever, bloodletting was often the go-to treatment. Imagine being weakened by illness, and then having precious blood drained away, further compromising your body's ability to fight infection. It was a practice that by its very nature actively harmed the patient, creating a cycle of illness and treatment that often proved fatal. Another wonder drug of the era responsible for untold misery and suffering was mercury. Yes, mercury, the very element we now know to be a potent neurotoxin. It was prescribed for an astonishing range of ailments: syphilis, depression, constipation, teething, pain in infants, and seemingly anything else a doctor couldn't immediately diagnose. The irony was that mercury treatment often induced symptoms that mimicked or worsened the original condition. Its side effects included brain damage, kidney failure, birth defects if administered to pregnant women, tooth loss, and severe tremors. So a patient seeking relief from depression might find themselves afflicted with tremors and cognitive impairment, caught in a vicious cycle of poisoning and new symptoms. It was a frightening testament to the era's ignorance of toxicology. Opium, too, played a significant and deeply problematic role in Victorian medicine. Its pain-relieving and sedative properties were well known, and it was readily available over the counter in various forms, most famously as laudanum, an alcoholic tincture of opium, or in commercially produced elixirs like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. These were routinely given to adults for pain anxiety and sleeplessness, but alarmingly, they were also very commonly administered to babies and young children. For infants suffering from colic teething pain or general fussiness, a dose of opium-based syrup was a common, albeit devastating, solution. This widespread use led to a massive silent epidemic of opium addiction, particularly among the poor and the vulnerable, creating a generation dependent on the very substance that was slowly poisoning them. Surgery, even more so than internal medicine, was a terrifying prospect. Without effective anesthesia until the very late Victorian period, and even then its use was unpredictable and dangerous. Most surgical procedures were performed with the patient fully conscious. Imagine being held down, experiencing searing pain and terror as a surgeon with crude instruments attempted to operate. And the risk of infection was astronomically high. Doctors did not wash their hands between patients, nor did they sterilize their instruments. It was not uncommon for a surgeon to examine a corpse to determine the cause of death, then proceed directly to operate on a living patient without so much as wiping their hands. Hospitals intended as places of healing were often more dangerous than staying-at-home breeding grounds for post-operative infections like sepsis. It was a stark, grim reality where the cure was often as dangerous as the disease. Primitive dentistry, as we've touched upon, was a source of immense suffering. Most people simply endured agonizing toothaches for as long as humanly possible. When extraction became unavoidable, it was often performed by barbers or blacksmiths using crude pliers or specialized unhygienic tools. There was no local anesthetic, no gentle pulling, just a forceful, often brutal removal of the offending tooth. The high risk of infection, the immense pain, and the lack of proper aftercare meant that many Victorians lived with the fear of dental problems throughout their lives, or ended up toothless and suffering the related consequences. It was a grim picture, a society constantly battling itself and its environment with rudimentary tools and a profound lack of scientific understanding, a constant struggle for basic health and comfort in a world that seemed determined to conspire against it. Beyond the personal struggle for bodily cleanliness and the often perilous journey through Victorian medicine, there was another daily gamble, one that affected everyone from the wealthiest merchant to the lowliest street sweeper: food hygiene. The most fundamental challenge was the complete absence of refrigeration as we know it today. Imagine your kitchen, or perhaps just a corner of your single room with no refrigerator, no freezer, no cool hum of modern appliances. Food, particularly perishable items like meat, milk, and fresh vegetables, was simply kept at room temperature. This meant that anything fresh began spoiling almost immediately, a race against the clock and the pervasive heat of a London summer or even the mild dampness of winter. While iceboxes did exist, they were incredibly expensive, a luxury afforded by very few, and even then, they relied on constantly replenished blocks of ice which were themselves a commodity. This dire lack of refrigeration forced Victorians to employ what we would now consider truly questionable preservation methods, each with its own set of compromises. Heavy salting was a common approach, particularly for meat. Chunks of beef or pork would be packed in enormous quantities of salt, drawing out the moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. The result was often meat that was mummified, incredibly tough and significantly less nutritious, its natural flavors obliterated by the sheer mineral content. It was sustenance, certainly, but far from a culinary delight. Think of it as nature's original exceedingly chewy jerky, but without the benefit of careful flavoring or modern processing. Smoking was another popular method involving curing meat over wood smoke for days or even weeks. This process, while effective in preserving the meat, infused it with a deep, often overpowering smoky flavor, creating something akin to a charcoal-flavored jerky. While tasty in small doses, a steady diet of such heavily smoked provisions carried its own long-term health risks, unbeknownst to the Victorians, as the carcinogenic compounds from the smoke slowly accumulated in their bodies. Then there was pickling, a method applied with astonishing zeal to almost everything imaginable, vegetables, eggs, and even meat, all submerged in vats of vinegar or brine. It was an effective way to prevent decay, but it transformed the texture and taste of the food entirely, making everything taste vaguely acidic and uniform. Variety, in the modern sense, was truly a luxury. The harsh reality was that much of the food consumed was already going bad. It was a matter of necessity, not preference. If a cut of meat started to turn green, the green bits would simply be cut off, and the rest would be heavily spiced and cooked. Milk that had curdled was not thrown out. It was often transformed into cheese or some other dairy product. Bread with a visible patch of mold. The mold was simply cut away and the rest consumed. This created a generation of people with what we might jokingly call iron stomachs, their digestive systems hardened by constant exposure to borderline spoilage. It was a daily act of defiance against microbial invasion, a testament to human resilience, and a rather alarming indifference to the subtle signs of decay. Adding to this precarious situation was the complete lack of safety oversight in the food industry. There were no expiration dates stamped on packages, no health inspectors making rounds to ensure cleanliness, and certainly no understanding of bacteria or the mechanisms of foodborne illness. People got sick, constantly experiencing bouts of vomiting, diarrhea, and fever, but they rarely connected these ailments to the food they had eaten. Instead, the blame was assigned to the prevailing bad air, or miasma theory, evil spirits, or simply bad luck. It was an invisible enemy, and without the scientific knowledge to identify it, there was no way to combat it effectively. The idea that a microscopic organism in your food could fell you was a concept light years beyond their comprehension. This means that the food you ate was truly a daily gamble, a roll of the dice with your health. The supply chain was riddled with opportunities for contamination and fraud. Milk, a staple for many, especially children, was frequently watered down to increase profits, and that water often came directly from the contaminated River Thames. Imagine giving your child a glass of milk that was effectively diluted with raw sewage. A horrifying thought that was a daily reality. The lack of baby formula meant infants were often given contaminated cow or goat milk, leading to tragically high rates of infant mortality from severe digestive illnesses, a silent scourge that decimated young lives. Beyond the dilution, the kitchens themselves were often breeding grounds for contamination. Uncleaned knives used for various tasks without proper washing led to cross-contamination, moving pathogens from raw meat to prepared vegetables or bread. Cutting boards were rarely sanitized, harboring unseen dangers. The very act of preparing a meal was fraught with risk, a constant dance with unseen microbial threats. The working conditions for many Victorians further exacerbated the problem of food hygiene. Factory workers, often toiling in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, would eat their meager lunches surrounded by an unsettling array of industrial pollutants. Soot from machinery, harsh chemicals used in manufacturing processes, oil, and even toxic fumes like lead dust or mercury vapor would saturate the air and settle on everything, including their food. Imagine trying to eat a dry piece of bread while the air around you shimmered with metallic dust. Miners deep underground would eat their meals in the dark, damp confines of the mine, covered head to toe in coal or mineral dust, which inevitably found its way into their mouths with every bite. Agricultural workers whose daily tasks involved handling vast quantities of manure to fertilize fields would then eat their lunch with unwashed hands, transferring pathogens directly to their food. It was a stark reminder that the environment you inhabited profoundly influenced every aspect of your life, including your most basic need for sustenance. Given the perilous state of London's water supply, it's perhaps unsurprising that alcohol, particularly beer or wine, was often considered the safe alternative to water. It was consumed with every meal, even by children who would often drink small beer, a very low-alcohol brew, for breakfast. For adults, it wasn't uncommon to consume several pints of beer or even wine throughout the day. The fermentation process involved in producing these beverages naturally killed off many of the harmful bacteria found in contaminated water, making them a comparatively safer choice. This led to a pervasive, if mild, state of intoxication as a kind of default for many, blurring the lines between hydration and inebriation. It was a grim choice: risk crippling illness from water or live in a perpetual state of slight tipsiness. To mask the inevitable decay and off flavors of less than fresh food, Victorian cuisine relied heavily on spices. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. These weren't just used for culinary preference. They were a practical necessity. A generous dusting of strong spices could effectively cover the taste of meat that was on the verge of spoiling, or bread that was a little too stale. It allowed people to consume food that might otherwise be unpalatable, making it a functional ingredient rather than just a flavor enhancer. It was a subtle act of culinary deception born of necessity. Beyond the challenges of spoilage and contamination, the Victorian food market was rife with rampant fraud. Profits were often prioritized over public health, and there was little regulation to prevent dishonest practices. Milk, as we noted, was routinely watered down. Beer was diluted, stretching supplies and increasing margins. Bread, a staple for everyone, was often adulterated. Chalk or alum might be mixed into the flour to make the bread appear whiter, and therefore more appealing, even if it offered no nutritional value. Sawdust was also astonishingly sometimes added as a cheap filler. Imagine biting into your daily loaf and finding it riddled with wood fibers. For the desperately poor, second-hand food markets were a common sight. Here, bruised, rotting, or past prime items would be sold at rock-bottom prices. Vegetables with soft spots, fruit covered in mold, and meat that had clearly seen better days found a market among those who had no other choice. And then there were the street vendors, a ubiquitous part of the urban landscape. They would sell their wares from open carts exposed to the elements, to dust, and to flies. Mystery meat pies, often made from dubious ingredients, would sit attracting insects. Their contents a genuine enigma to the buyer. It was a system of buyer beware on a grand, dangerous scale, with no way for the average person to test what they were eating or ascertain its safety. Every meal was a gamble, every bite a potential risk. This daily struggle for basic safe sustenance permeated every social stratum, though it was most acutely felt by the poor. The idea of food safety as an inherent right or even a concept was a long, arduous journey away forged out of persistent suffering and eventual scientific enlightenment. This constant, multifaceted assault on basic hygiene and public health reached its undeniable peak in London during the summer of 1858, an event famously dubbed the Great Stink. Before this pivotal moment, London's rapidly mounting crisis was a slow-motion disaster years in the making. The city's population had exploded, reaching an astonishing 2 million people by the 1850s, a staggering number for the time. This unprecedented growth completely overwhelmed London's antiquated and utterly insufficient waste disposal systems. The old ways, chamber pots, backyard privies, and the subterranean horrors of cesspools, were simply not designed to cope with the sheer volume of effluent produced by so many inhabitants. They were overflowing constantly, their contents frequently seeping into cellars, backing up into residential streets, or most crucially being dumped directly into the River Thames. The Thames, the very artery of London, played a dual and tragically contradictory role in the city's life. On one hand, it was the primary dumping ground for virtually all of London's human and industrial waste. Every day, countless tons of raw sewage industrial effluent from factories and the accumulated filth of millions flowed directly into its waters. On the other hand, simultaneously, the very same river remained a main source of drinking water for a significant portion of the populace. Imagine for a moment drawing your drinking water from a river that was at the same time serving as the city's primary open sewer. This direct, unfettered contamination created an inescapable cycle leading to constant devastating outbreaks of waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid, which swept through the population with terrifying regularity. Despite the obvious, undeniable filth, the visible sewage, the overwhelming stench, the undeniable link between proximity to certain areas and outbreaks of disease, the prevailing medical misconception of the era was the miasma theory. This theory held that diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells themselves, rather than the underlying unsanitary conditions that generated those odors. It was intuitively appealing if something smelled terrible, it must be making you sick. So solutions focused on masking the odors rather than removing their source. People would burn sulfur-spread lime or chloride, or simply douse themselves in perfume, believing that if they could just conquer the smell, the disease would somehow disappear. It was a fundamental misreading of cause and effect, an invisible enemy misunderstood, allowing the true agents of illness to flourish. Then came the summer of 1858, a period that would forever be etched in London's memory for its truly unprecedented conditions. It was a summer of extreme uncharacteristic heat, far warmer and more prolonged than usual. This heat, combined with an extended drought, caused the River Thames to run incredibly low. As the water level dropped, it exposed vast, thick, sickening deposits of sewage and refuse that had accumulated for decades on its banks and along the riverbed. The lower water level and the intense heat acted as a perfect, horrifying incubator, accelerating the decomposition and fermentation of this waste to an unimaginable degree. The smell that ensued was, by all contemporary accounts, beyond description. It was 1,000 times worse than any stench Londoners had ever experienced of vile, nauseating miasma that permeated every corner of the city. People walking near the river were seen vomiting from the sheer proximity to the overwhelming odor. Families who lived near the Thames, particularly in poorer districts, simply abandoned their homes, fleeing the suffocating putrid air. The renowned writer Charles Dickens, a keen observer of London life, famously, and perhaps somewhat understatedly, called the Thames a deadly sewer, describing the river as a opaque and fetid ditch, the banks of which were covered with a thick, slimy ooze, on which the sun shone breeding filth. Scientific observers noted that if you dipped a piece of white paper into the river's brown, soupy mess, it would instantly disappear, swallowed by the sheer density of the pollution. This was not just an unpleasant smell. It was a weaponized stench, a physical manifestation of the city's unmanaged decay, making life utterly unbearable for anyone within its reach. The pervasive, suffocating stench of the Great Stink reached its most critical and politically potent point when it directly impacted the Houses of Parliament. Located squarely on the banks of the River Thames, the seat of British power became literally unbearable. The grand ornate windows of the Parliament building, usually kept open for ventilation, instead became conduits for the horrific stench, allowing the putrid air to pour unobstructed into the very chambers where the nation's laws were debated and decided. Members of Parliament, distinguished gentlemen accustomed to a certain level of comfort, were literally seen fleeing the chamber, gagging and retching, pressing handkerchiefs, sometimes soaked in disinfectant or perfume, a desperate, futile gesture, to their noses in a desperate attempt to fend off the overwhelming reek. It was a crisis that could no longer be ignored or delegated to the working class. This direct, undeniable inconvenience to the nation's leaders finally spurred decisive action, demonstrating a fundamental truth about political will. Sometimes only a crisis that impacts those in power directly can force fundamental systemic change. Attempts to mask the smell with lime and chloride. The standard miasma theory solutions proved utterly futile against the sheer scale of the stench. Serious consideration was even given to the extreme measure of relocating the entire government away from Westminster, an admission of defeat that would have been a national humiliation. The urgency was palpable. Something finally had to be done. It was in this atmosphere of desperate necessity that the remarkable engineer Joseph Bazalgette was thrust into the spotlight. Joseph Bazalgette, a man whose name should be far more widely known, was the brilliant engineer tasked with solving London's catastrophic sewage problem. The scale of the challenge he faced was immense, almost unfathomable. Imagine being handed the responsibility for the waste of 2.5 million people's worth of poop. A mountain of human effluent generated daily with no effective means of disposal. It was a problem that had plagued London for centuries, growing exponentially with its population. Bazalgette's genius lay not in proposing minor fixes or patchwork solutions to the existing broken system. Instead, he had the audacious vision to propose a completely new integrated sewer system, a monumental feat of civil engineering that would transform the very foundations of the city. His master plan was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. It involved laying over 1,000 miles of new interconnected sewers beneath London's labyrinthine streets. These local sewers would collect waste from individual homes and neighborhoods, channeling it into massive main intercepting sewers, colossal subterranean tunnels, some large enough to walk through, running parallel to the Thames. The brilliant innovation was to design these intercepting sewers to carry all of London's waste far downstream, an astonishing 8 miles from the city center to treatment works, though rudimentary by modern standards, and then out into the Thames at specially chosen points timed specifically for high tide. The idea was that the powerful outgoing tide would ensure the waste was carried far out to sea, away from the city's drinking water intakes and its populated areas. It was a plan of unparalleled foresight. The construction effort required to bring Bazalgette's vision to life was truly Herculean. The project was immense, arguably the largest civil engineering undertaking of its time. It involved digging up half the city of London, a colossal disruption to daily life. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make way for the vast network of underground tunnels. Thousands upon thousands of families were relocated their homes, sacrificed for the greater good of public health. For years, London was a constant construction site. Noise, dust, and disruption became the background hum of the city. Workers toiled deep underground in incredibly difficult and dangerous conditions, covered not just in mud, but in the very sewage they were attempting to channel away. It was a testament to sheer human grit and the raw power of manual labor. The engineering marvels of the project extended beyond the miles of tunnels. Bazalgette's system required the construction of massive pumping stations, architectural triumphs in their own right, designed to lift the sewage uphill so it could flow by gravity through the intercepting sewers to the distant outfalls. These were grand cathedral-like structures housing enormous steam-powered engines that tirelessly pushed London's effluent along. Millions upon millions of bricks were used to line the vast network of tunnels and pumping stations, creating an infrastructure that was built to last for centuries. Furthermore, the project involved the creation of new embankments along the River Thames itself. Grand architectural features that not only reclaimed land, but also cleverly housed the new main sewers, seamlessly integrating them into the city's fabric. Of course, a project of such unprecedented scale and ambition came with an equally immense cost. The overall expenditure was staggering, equivalent to billions, perhaps even tens of billions of pounds in modern money. This required significant financial maneuvering, increased taxes on Londoners, the issuance of government bonds, and substantial loans from banks. Naturally, there were widespread public complaints about the expense. People grumbled about the taxes, questioned the necessity of such a grand undertaking, and surely felt the pinch of the financial burden. However, the ultimate success of the project and the profound tangible benefits it delivered would eventually more than justify every penny spent. It was an investment in the very future of the city, a recognition that the cost of inaction was far greater than the cost of revolutionary change. The immediate and profound impact of Bazalgette's sewer system once it came online was nothing short of miraculous. When the new network began to function, the change was by all accounts immediate. The unbearable stench that had defined London for generations, that oppressive, sickening miasma, simply disappeared. It wasn't a gradual fading, it was a sudden, dramatic cessation. The River Thames, once a deadly sewer, began to run visibly cleaner, its surface no longer a thick brown soup. It was a transformation that defied prior experience, a visible and olfactory testament to human ingenuity. More significantly, the medical impact was equally, if not more, profound. Cholera outbreaks, which had ravaged London with terrifying regularity, became less frequent, then largely ceased. Typhoid rates, another devastating waterborne disease, plummeted dramatically. People stopped dying from illnesses that were entirely preventable diseases that had been perceived as an inevitable part of urban life, a cruel lottery of fate. For a population that had suffered for generations, seeing disease rates drop so precipitously felt nothing short of magic. It was a visceral, undeniable demonstration that public health could be engineered, that scientific understanding coupled with immense practical effort could genuinely save lives on an unprecedented scale. The socio-economic benefits rippled through the city. People could once again walk along the river without gagging, without the immediate threat of nausea. This seemingly simple pleasure had a profound effect. Property values in previously undesirable areas along the Thames, once blighted by the stench and disease, soared as people felt safe and comfortable living there again. Businesses which had suffered from the general unpleasantness of the city began to thrive as customers returned and the overall quality of life improved. The psychological impact was enormous. A deep-seated belief began to take root that change was truly possible, that the intractable problems of urban life could be solved, and that lives could genuinely improve through collective action and scientific application. It was a restoration of hope, a reassertion of human agency in the face of overwhelming environmental challenges. Of course, no system, especially one of such pioneering scale, is perfect. There were lingering imperfections and crucially unequal benefits that reflected the persistent social inequalities of Victorian society. Even Bazalgette's ingenious system still ultimately dumped raw sewage into the Thames, albeit much further downstream beyond the city's main population centers. It was in essence a strategic displacement of the problem, a shifting of London's waste to become someone else's problem further out to sea. This was in time recognized as insufficient, leading to later developments in sewage treatment. Furthermore, occasional pumping station breakdowns or periods of extreme rain could still cause temporary backups and overflows, reminding Londoners that the fight against waste was a continuous one. The social inequality in implementation was a stark reality. Wealthy neighborhoods with their influential residents and better infrastructure were connected to the new sewer system, first often enjoying the benefits almost immediately. Poorer areas, however, often had to wait sometimes for years for the pipes to reach their streets and homes. So while the rich began to enjoy odor-free lives and healthier environments, the poor often continued to contend with overflowing cesspools and raw sewage in their immediate vicinity. It was a slow, uneven process, but eventually, as more and more areas were connected, the improvements gradually spread across the board, lifting the baseline of public health for all, even if it took longer for some than others. The Great Stink and Bazalgette's response stands as a pivotal moment, a testament to what happens when a problem becomes so unignorable that it forces a society to collectively innovate and invest in its own future. The monumental success of Bazalgette's sewers, while a triumph of engineering, also played a crucial, if initially unacknowledged, role in the unraveling of medical mysteries and cultural shifts that defined the late Victorian era. For centuries, the very mystery of how disease spread had baffled scientists and doctors alike. As we touched upon the dominant belief, the one that truly held sway over the public and medical establishment, was the miasma theory. This theory, seemingly intuitive, given the putrid environment of industrial cities, posited that diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells emanating from decaying organic matter. It was a compelling idea. If something smelled terrible, it must be making you sick. The logic on the surface seemed sound. If a neighborhood reeked of sewage and people were dying, then the stench must be the culprit. This seemingly logical but fundamentally flawed understanding of causality dictated treatments and public health interventions for generations. If bad smells were the problem, then the solution was to eliminate or mask those smells. So people would burn sulfur, a pungent, acrid gas, hoping its fumes would somehow purify the air. Tar, with its strong medicinal scent, would be burned in the streets. Strong perfumes and fragrant oils became popular not just for personal adornment, but as a perceived defense against the unseen dangers of the urban air. The focus was on the odor itself, on the sensory manifestation of decay, rather than on the invisible pathogens lurking within the decay. It was a costly and ineffective battle waged against the wrong enemy, a constant effort to spray air freshener on a city-sized pile of manure. But quietly, meticulously, a revolutionary truth was being unearthed, challenging this deeply entrenched belief. The mystery of cholera's terrifying spread was famously and definitively solved by a man whose name, like Basil Jett's, deserves far more recognition, Dr. John Snow, a physician and anesthesiologist. In 1854, during a severe cholera outbreak in London's Soho district, Snow undertook a meticulous, painstaking investigation that was groundbreaking in its scientific rigor. He didn't rely on prevailing theories. He relied on observation data and mapping. He painstakingly interviewed residents, mapping the incidence of cholera cases street by street, house by house. His now famous investigation of the Broad Street pump incident provided undeniable, irrefutable evidence that the disease was not airborne, but waterborne. He noticed that nearly all the cholera victims drew their water from a specific public pump on Broad Street, while those who drank from other sources, or from a brewery whose employees drank only beer, remained largely unaffected. Snow proved through sheer empirical data that people were getting sick from drinking sewage-contaminated water, not from breathing the bad air around them. He literally traced the outbreak to a single point of contamination. A leaky cesspool near the pump had allowed cholera-infected waste to seep into the well. This was a direct head-on challenge to the established medical consensus of the miasma theory, a frontal assault on centuries of accepted wisdom. Imagine the resistance, the disbelief from a medical establishment that had built its entire understanding of disease on the concept of bad air. Initially, Dr. Snow's theory was met with skepticism, if not outright dismissal by the powerful medical establishment. His ideas were considered crazy, a fringe notion from an eccentric doctor. The prevailing wisdom was too deeply ingrained, too convenient, too tied to existing power structures to be easily overturned by a mere map and some observations. Sadly, thousands more died needlessly in subsequent outbreaks before his theory began to gain widespread acceptance. It was a slow, arduous battle against intellectual inertia. However, the subsequent success of Basil Jett's colossal sewer system provided powerful empirical and undeniable validation for Snow's findings. When the sewers came online and London's cholera and typhoid rates plummeted, the connection between removing sewage and reducing disease became starkly clear, even if the explicit link to germs wasn't immediately obvious to everyone. The raw data of disappearing epidemics spoke louder than any scientific paper could, quietly but forcefully proving that cleanliness, not merely fresh air, was the true antidote to the invisible killers that stalked the Victorian city. The empirical evidence from London's plummeting disease rates, a silent testament to Snow's insights, began to open doors for the burgeoning field of microbiology. The work of pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, among others, gradually provided the irrefutable scientific proof for the existence of microorganisms, bacteria and viruses, as the true agents causing disease. This was a truly revolutionary breakthrough, perhaps one of the most significant in the history of human health. For the first time, humanity had a real understanding of why people got sick, not just how. It allowed for the development of targeted prevention strategies, moving beyond guesswork and superstition to genuine evidence-based interventions. The invisible enemy was finally seen and understood under the lens of a microscope. With this new understanding, revolutionary medical advice began to emerge, transforming practices that seem incredibly basic to us today into groundbreaking life-saving measures. Hand washing, for instance, transitioned from a mere social custom, something you might do before eating, to appear polite to a critical medical necessity. Doctors and nurses, previously vectors of disease, began to understand that their own hands could carry deadly pathogens from one patient to another. This simple act, so often overlooked before, became a cornerstone of infection control. Similarly, wound care was fundamentally reevaluated. Keeping wounds clean and covered, protecting them from airborne germs, became a matter of life and death, not just aesthetics. Before germ theory, a wound might be left open to air out, or even encouraged to fester, leading to rampant infection and often amputation or death. Now the emphasis was on asepsis. The importance of utensil hygiene also became apparent. Avoiding sharing eating utensils, something taken for granted in modern dining, was a revelation. Before, a communal spoon or drinking cup was common, an innocent act that unknowingly facilitated the spread of diseases. And the proper storage and preparation of food from the farm to the table was finally understood to literally save lives. The fight against contaminated milk, adulterated bread, and spoiled meat could now be waged with scientific precision rather than blind hope. These concepts, which are so ingrained in our daily lives today that they seem like common sense, were truly groundbreaking at the time, fundamental shifts in how people viewed their bodies, their food, and their environment. This new scientific knowledge also initiated a profound transformation of hospitals. Previously, hospitals were often high-risk places for infection, places where the sick went to die rather than to heal. Doctors would operate in blood-stained coats. Instruments were used on patient after patient without cleaning, and open wounds were exposed to the same air as patients suffering from highly contagious diseases. But with the acceptance of germ theory, hospitals began to implement basic sanitation protocols. Washing instruments between patients initially met with resistance and ridicule from some doctors who found it an unnecessary bother became standard practice. Requiring doctors to wash their hands before examining or operating on patients once considered an affront to their professional dignity became mandatory. Isolating contagious patients to prevent the spread of airborne or contact-based infections revolutionized ward management. As a direct result of these seemingly simple measures, there was a dramatic drop in hospital death rates, clearly demonstrating the undeniable connection between cleanliness and health. The hospital, once a place of last resort, slowly began its transformation into a place of genuine healing. Beyond the medical establishment, these scientific breakthroughs began to filter into the broader culture, leading to significant cultural and educational shifts in hygiene. Schools, recognizing the power of early education, started teaching basic hygiene to children. Lessons on the importance of hand washing, the proper way to brush teeth, even with those crude tools, and the value of keeping clothes clean, became part of the curriculum. Children's sponges for new information brought these lessons home, often subtly influencing their parents and spreading better practices, especially in poor areas where adults might have had less access to formal health information or medical advice. It was a bottom-up approach to public health and investment in the next generation. Alongside formal education, organized public health campaigns began to emerge, often with unexpected partners. Soap companies, seeing a vast new market, became key players, funding poster campaigns that promoted sanitation. These vibrant, eye-catching advertisements depicted proper hand-washing techniques, emphasized the importance of safe waste disposal, and encouraged general home cleanliness. The message, though simple, was revolutionary for its time. Being clean will keep you healthy. Taking care of your body is important. You have some control over whether you get sick. This was immensely empowering. For generations, illness had been seen as an act of God, a random stroke of bad luck, or a punishment for sin. Now there was a tangible link between personal action and personal health, a sense of agency that had been previously unimaginable. This new understanding of hygiene, fueled by both scientific discovery and public health campaigns, created a powerful feedback loop that profoundly influenced marketing and attitude change. Crucial to this shift was the invention and refinement of cheaper, gentler soap. Before, soap manufacturing often involved harsh lye and animal fat, producing a coarse, often irritating product. But as chemical processes improved and the understanding of ingredients advanced, manufacturers learned to create more refined, milder soaps that were not only more pleasant to use but also more affordable for the general populace. This democratized cleanliness, making a truly effective cleaning agent accessible to a wider segment of society. Companies, quick to recognize the burgeoning market, began to segment their products, marketing different types of soap for different purposes. There was soap for laundry, heavy-duty, and effective for tackling ingrained grime. There was general-purpose household soap for cleaning surfaces. And crucially, there was soap specifically marketed for personal use. For the face, for the body, even medicated soaps promising to cure skin ailments. Advertising campaigns became incredibly sophisticated, associating soap not just with cleanliness, but with beauty, health, and perhaps most powerfully, with social success. Before and after pictures, often exaggerated but compelling, showed individuals transformed from grimy, unhealthy figures into radiant, respectable citizens. Stories were spun about the social benefits of cleanliness, how a fresh appearance could secure a job, win a suitor, or simply garner respect in a judgmental society. This shrewd marketing played a huge, often underestimated role in shifting cultural attitudes. Hygiene transformed from a simple necessity into a desirable virtue, something achievable, aspirational, and deeply intertwined with one's social standing. It cemented cleanliness not just as a medical imperative, but as a moral and social obligation. This brings us to segment 4, where we can explore the intricate interplay of social stratification, public perception, and lasting transformation. Examining how cleanliness became a powerful social marker and how specific groups drove the reform that ultimately reshaped society. The class divide in hygiene practices, while somewhat alleviated by broader public health improvements, remained a stark reality throughout the Victorian era. Wealthy Victorians certainly had access to more resources, which on the surface translated to a more comfortable and seemingly cleaner existence. They could afford those fancier copper bathtubs, even if filling them was a colossal undertaking. They had access to more soap, often the finer, more fragrant varieties. Their wardrobes were larger, their clothing made of finer fabrics, allowing for more frequent changes and theoretically a greater degree of freshness. Their elaborate beauty routines, though often involving rather odd ingredients, were a testament to their ability to invest in personal presentation. However, even the elite were ultimately constrained by the era's fundamental limitations. No amount of wealth could conjure running hot water on demand or instill an understanding of germ theory before it was scientifically proven or make ineffective medicine suddenly potent. Their cleanliness, while superior to the working class, was still relative to modern standards and often involved a significant compromise outsourcing the dirty work. This is where the paradox of servants becomes truly evident. Wealthy households relied heavily on a large staff of servants, maids, laundresses, bath attendants, housekeepers, footmen, and more, for virtually every daily hygiene task. Imagine a maid emptying your chamber pot every morning, carrying heavy pails of hot water for your bath, or a laundress toiling for hours scrubbing your family's linen. These tasks, physically demanding and intimately connected to the body's less glamorous functions, were the bedrock of elite comfort. The irony, and indeed the quiet tragedy, was that the very servants who maintained the employer's cleanliness were often themselves dirtier. They lived in vastly different conditions, cramped, often unsanitary servants' quarters, sharing beds, lacking proper washing facilities, with little time or resources for their own personal hygiene. Their lives were a relentless cycle of labor, leaving little energy or opportunity for the kind of personal care they provided to their employers. A servant might maintain a perfect front-facing appearance, perhaps a freshly pressed uniform, impeccably gloved hands, or meticulous hair and manners. But their own bodies, hidden beneath their work clothes, often lacked basic care. They were the invisible engines of Victorian comfort, their own struggles against grime, a silent testament to the deeply stratified society they inhabited. For the vast majority, the plight of the poor was a stark counterpoint to even the compromised cleanliness of the wealthy. For those living on the breadline basic survival, securing enough food, paying the exorbitant rent for a cramped room, scrounging enough coal for warmth, took absolute precedence over hygiene. Spending precious money on soap, a commodity that still held significant value, or dedicating valuable time to the laborious process of bathing and laundry was not just difficult. It was often an impossible luxury. When every penny, every waking hour was dedicated to keeping body and soul together, the luxury of feeling truly clean became a distant dream. They simply adapted accepting daily filth and a pervasive, often strong body odor as the normal, unavoidable conditions of existence. It wasn't a choice, it was a reality. In this context, cleanliness became inextricably linked with social judgment, transforming into a powerful social marker. To be dirty was to be perceived as lazy, immoral, or even inherently degenerate, irrespective of one's actual circumstances. A person's appearance, their perceived cleanliness, became a direct indicator of their character and their standing in society. This created immense social pressure to appear clean, even if true cleanliness was unattainable. It was a subtle yet pervasive form of class warfare, where the visible signs of poverty were often conflated with moral failings. This led to what we might call front-facing hygiene among the working class. Individuals would obsessively wash the visible parts of their body, their hands, their face, their neck, sometimes multiple times a day. They would also expend enormous effort to keep their outer clothing, especially any visible layers, as neat and tidy as humanly possible, even if the undergarments or the clothes beneath were less than fresh. This wasn't vanity. It was a strategic, essential effort to avoid social condemnation. A clean face and tidy outer garments might mean the difference between getting a job and being turned away, between being treated with a modicum of respect and being dismissed as a vagrant. It was a societal performance, a daily act of presenting a respectable facade to the world, even if the rest of their person remained unwashed and their living conditions were a constant battle against grime. The turning point of the Great Stink, as we've discussed, was not merely an engineering triumph. It represented a fundamental shift in public health and societal transformation. The crisis forced the government and the broader public to acknowledge a crucial truth that collective action was not just helpful, but absolutely necessary to solve problems that individuals simply could not tackle on their own. No amount of personal hygiene could clean the Thames or remove the mountains of street waste. Bazalgette's sewer system, with its immense scale and undeniable impact, vividly demonstrated that human engineering could solve problems that had seemed unsolvable. It was a monumental achievement that fostered a new belief that urban conditions, no matter how dire, could indeed be improved. This tangible success sparked a broader movement for urban reform, inspiring other cities and driving further legislation to improve living conditions. Within this burgeoning movement, women emerged as crucial, often unsung driving forces for reform. It was women dealing with the daily realities of family health and hygiene, the constant sickness of children, the endless battle against dirt and disease in the home, the tragic reality of high infant mortality, who most acutely understood the desperate need for fundamental change. They weren't just experiencing the problems, they were living with the horrifying consequences of unsanitary conditions every single day. They channeled this lived experience into powerful activism. They formed organizations and societies focused explicitly on public health, child welfare, and sanitation reform. These groups, often dismissed by male politicians as mere ladies' clubs, became powerful lobbying forces demanding better housing laws, advocating for cleaner water supplies, and pushing for improved medical care, especially for the poor and vulnerable. Their activism was not merely a political fight. It was a deeply personal struggle for basic human dignity, and quite literally, the right to raise children who might actually survive past infancy. The tireless efforts of these reformers, combined with the growing scientific understanding of disease, led to slow but crucial improvements in food safety laws and regulations towards the end of the Victorian era. The transition from a perilous buyer beware market, where consumers literally gambled with their lives at every meal, to a system with nascent oversight was a fundamental shift. Early laws targeting food adulteration, while imperfect, represented a recognition that the government had a role to play in protecting its citizens from dishonest and dangerous practices. Health inspectors, though few and far between, initially began to make their presence felt, providing at least some deterrent to the worst forms of food fraud and contamination. This gradual change, allowing people to trust that their food wouldn't actively kill them, had an almost unimaginable impact. It dramatically improved overall public health and saved countless lives, particularly reducing the terrifyingly high rates of child mortality from digestive illnesses which had previously decimated young populations. The invisible war against foodborne pathogens was finally, if slowly, beginning to be won. The success of these public health initiatives, from sewers to food regulations, led to a profound psychological shift across society. For generations, people had accepted their terrible living conditions as an immutable fact of life, an inevitable consequence of urban existence, or simply divine will. But the tangible evidence of improvement, the disappearing stench, the plummeting death rates, made it clear that change was not only possible, but achievable through human agency and collective effort. This sparked a newfound demand for better living conditions. People began to actively campaign for better housing, for cleaner streets, for safer working environments in factories and mines. The expectation of squalor began to be replaced by the expectation of basic decency and health. For the first time in generations, parents could realistically expect their children to not only survive infancy, but to grow up healthier and live longer lives than they themselves had. This belief in progress and the power of human ingenuity to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, and the implicit understanding of the right to health, became a fundamental human right shaping societal expectations for generations to come. Much of the legacy of the Victorian hygiene revolution is ironically invisible to modern eyes, precisely because it works so well. We take for granted the intricate network of sewers beneath our feet, the clean water that flows effortlessly from our taps, the regular collection of our garbage, and the fundamental food safety regulations that protect us from dangerous pathogens. These systems, the very bedrock of modern urban life, are direct descendants of the Victorian pioneers' vision and labor. We rarely stop to think about the complex infrastructure that allows us to live in comfort and health simply because it functions seamlessly. A silent, efficient machine operating beneath the surface of our awareness. It is a testament to the enduring foresight and engineering prowess of those who built it. Despite the immense challenges they faced, the Victorians demonstrated remarkable human adaptability and pride. Living in an environment that was constantly assaulting their senses and threatening their health, they still found ways to maintain a sense of dignity and take pride in their appearance even within their severe constraints. The effort to keep hands and faces clean, to wear the best possible clothing to attempt to maintain pleasant breath, these were not trivial acts. They were small but significant affirmations of self-worth in a world that often sought to diminish it. And beyond the practicalities of hygiene, they still fell in love. Married, raised families found joy in simple pleasures and pursued art, culture, and intellectual endeavors. Life, despite its grimy realities, was still lived with passion and purpose. The Victorian hygiene revolution represents one of the greatest, if often overlooked, public health improvements in human history. It saved millions upon millions of lives, not with dramatic battlefield heroics, but with pipes, bricks, and scientific insight. It literally enabled the modern urban life we now enjoy, making cities habitable on a scale that was previously unthinkable. It showed unequivocally that seemingly impossible problems like cleaning a sprawling city of millions could be solved with determination, with the application of scientific understanding, and with the necessary political will to invest in the collective good. The reformers and engineers of this era, many of whom didn't live to see the full long-term benefits of their work, operated with remarkable selflessness and vision, building a healthier future for subsequent generations. Their quiet heroism built a better world, brick by grimy brick. And so, as we reflect on this often unseen side of Victorian life, a deep appreciation for the everyday comforts of modern hygiene settles upon us. Consider for a moment the simple luxury of a hot shower, the immediate gush of clean, heated water, the rich lather of fragrant soap, the feeling of absolute freshness as you step out. It's a sensory experience that was utterly unimaginable for the vast majority of people even a century and a half ago. Or think of slipping into clean clothes pulled from a modern washing machine and dryer soft and free of the lingering odors of previous wears. These are not just conveniences. They are profound indicators of progress, quiet blessings that allow us to live with a level of comfort and personal dignity that our Victorian ancestors could only dream of. The ability to open a refrigerator and access safe, fresh food, or to trust that the water from our tap is potable and free of deadly pathogens, frees up an enormous amount of mental and physical energy that Victorians were forced to expend on mere survival. The knowledge that if we fall ill, effective medicine and sterile surgical procedures are available rather than bloodletting or mercury is a profound relief. These are the invisible triumphs of the Victorian era, the foundation upon which our modern health and well-being are built. Yet this historical journey also serves as a powerful reminder that many of the same fundamental challenges, access to clean water and sanitation, the devastating impact of poverty on health, and the persistence of social inequality in healthcare and living conditions, continue to persist globally in various forms. While much of the developed world enjoys the fruits of the Victorian hygiene revolution, billions elsewhere still struggle with conditions that would be familiar to a Londoner of 1850. The fight for basic human dignity and health, the very things the Victorians fought for, continues in different parts of the world. The Victorian example stands as a powerful testament to the fact that radical positive change is possible. It was born out of persistent struggle, scientific creativity, immense engineering feats, and a stubborn hope for a better future. It teaches us that seemingly impossible problems that appear so entrenched they are part of the very fabric of existence, can indeed be solved with enough determination and collective will. The transformation of London from an open sewer to a model of public health driven by the desperation of the Great Stink and the brilliance of visionaries like Bazalgette and Snow is a story of enduring human resilience and ingenuity. It's a story that whispers to us across the centuries, reminding us of the quiet revolutions that shape our world and the uncelebrated heroes who made them possible. And as we drift towards the quiet end of our journey through Victorian grime and eventual triumph, allow your mind to gently soften, much like the rigid corset of the Victorian lady slowly yielding to the passage of time. The sounds of the horse-drawn carriages, the distant cries of street vendors, and the pervasive acrid smell of coal smoke begin to recede, fading into the peaceful silence of your own space. You are no longer navigating the crowded, chaotic streets of 19th century London, where every step was a gamble and every breath a reminder of a constant struggle. Instead, you are safely nestled in the comfort of your present, surrounded by the quiet hum of modern life, the assurance of unseen infrastructure working tirelessly for your well-being. Feel the familiar softness of your pillow, the gentle warmth of your blankets, a stark contrast to the rough, scratchy bedding and damp walls of a bygone era. The knowledge that clean, fresh water is always at your command, that unseen waste is whisked away without a thought, and that the air you breathe is free from the overwhelming stench of decay. These are profound, quiet blessings. Allow the images of the past to gently dissolve like smoke curling lazily from a chimney, dissipating into the vastness of your slumber. The battles against cholera and typhoid have been fought and won. The tireless work of engineers and reformers has laid the foundation for the healthy world you inhabit. There is nothing left to fight, nothing to fear, nothing but the quiet descent into a peaceful night. The faint whisper of history, having shared its wisdom, now gently encourages you to rest. All is well. Sleep deeply and dream sweetly.